The radio crackled at 3 in the morning, and Daniel Cross knew before he even answered it that his life was about to change. "Cross, get to the gate, now, no questions." He did not ask questions. He grabbed his boots, laced them in the dark, and stepped out into the cold night air of the training base. 6 months earlier he had been a nobody, a young man from a small town who had joined the army because he did not know what else to do with his life. Now he was standing at a gate, waiting for a truck with no markings, about to join a unit that other soldiers only spoke about in whispers. They called it the Monsters. Nobody used that name to their faces. It was a name born from fear, passed from one frightened enemy to another, until it became legend. Daniel had heard stories in the mess hall, stories that made even hardened men go quiet. Some said the unit never lost a mission. Others said the men in it were not fully human anymore, that something in them had changed after years in the field. Daniel did not believe in monsters, but he was about to find out how the name came to be. The truck arrived without headlights, sliding to a stop in front of him like a shadow. The door opened, and a man stepped out. He was not tall, but he carried himself in a way that made him seem larger than he was. His eyes moved over Daniel slowly, taking in every detail, the way a buyer studies a horse before deciding whether it is worth the price. "You're Cross," the man said. It was not a question. "Yes, sir. I'm Vance, commander of this unit. Get in." Daniel climbed into the back of the truck, and the door slammed shut behind him. Inside, 3 other men sat in silence, their faces lit only by the dim glow of a single overhead light. Nobody introduced themselves. Nobody smiled. The truck lurched forward, and Daniel understood, in that moment, that whatever life he had known before was already behind him. They drove for hours, deep into a region the maps barely acknowledged, a stretch of land called Kestrel Valley, wedged between mountains and a border that had changed hands more times than anyone could count. It was a place where old conflicts had never truly ended, only gone quiet for a while before flaring up again. Daniel had read about it in briefings, dry facts about supply routes and armed groups, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of arriving there in the dead of night, not knowing what waited for him. When the truck finally stopped, Daniel stepped out into a camp that looked nothing like the base he had left behind. There were no neat rows of tents, no polished booths lined up outside doors. Instead, there was a scattering of low buildings, half hidden under camouflage netting, and men moving between them with the quiet efficiency of people who had done this 1,000 times before. Vance led him to a building near the center of the camp. Inside, a woman was cleaning a rifle at a long table, her hands moving with practiced ease. She looked up when they entered, studying Daniel with the same careful eyes Vance had used. "This is Grace," Vance said. "She'll show you where you're sleeping. Tomorrow, you meet the rest." Grace did not smile, but there was something in the way she nodded that felt less cold than Vance's greeting. She led Daniel to a small room with a cot and a single shelf, and left him there without another word. Daniel sat on the cot for a long time, staring at the wall, wondering what he had gotten himself into. Sleep did not come easily that night. He kept thinking about the whispers back at the base, about men who supposedly did not lose missions, about the name Monsters and what it might really mean. When morning finally came, he was ready to meet whatever waited for him. The camp came alive with the sunrise. Daniel stepped outside to find dozens of soldiers already moving through their routines, running drills, checking equipment, speaking in low voices. Nobody paid him much attention, and for a moment, he felt entirely alone. Then a large man approached him, his face weathered and scarred in a way that told stories he clearly did not want to share. "You're the new one," the man said. "I'm Marcus Hale." "Come on, Vance wants everyone at the briefing tent." Daniel followed Marcus across the camp, and as they walked, Marcus spoke without being asked. "Don't let the name scare you," he said. "Monsters. It's not what people think." "What is it then?" Marcus paused, considering the question as if it deserved real thought. "It's what happens when good people get pushed into situations where the normal rules stop making sense. We didn't choose the name. The people we fight gave it to us, because we don't back down, and we don't leave people behind. That scares them more than anything else we do." Daniel wanted to ask more, but they had already reached the briefing tent, where the rest of the unit had gathered. There were perhaps 20 men and women inside, all watching as Vance stood at the front, a map spread out on the table before him. "Listen up," Vance said. "We have new information. There's a village 3 miles north of here, called Ashvale. Intelligence says an armed group is moving toward it, planning to take the village by force before nightfall. The local government forces are too far away to respond in time. We are the only unit close enough to stop this." A murmur passed through the room, but nobody argued. Daniel realized, watching their faces, that this was not the first time they had received orders like this. This was simply what they did. "Cross," Vance said, looking directly at him. "You're with Hale and Bennett today. Stay close, listen to instructions, and you'll be fine." Daniel nodded, though his stomach twisted with nerves. He had trained for years, but training was nothing like the real thing, and he knew it. Within the hour, the unit was moving, vehicles rumbling along a dirt road that wound through the hills toward Ashvale. Daniel sat beside Marcus and a woman named Ryan Cole, a sniper whose quiet confidence Daniel found both comforting and unsettling. She checked her rifle twice during the ride, her fingers moving with an ease that spoke of years of practice, but she never once looked nervous. "First mission?" she asked, without looking at him. "Yes. Stay behind me. Watch what I do. You'll learn faster that way than any classroom could teach you." The vehicles stopped a mile outside the village, and the unit moved forward on foot, spreading out through the trees with a discipline that Daniel had never seen before. There was no wasted motion, no unnecessary noise. Every person seemed to know exactly where to go and what to do, as if they had rehearsed this exact moment 100 times. As they approached Ashvale, Daniel could see smoke rising in the distance, and his heart began to pound. The armed group had already arrived, and from the sounds echoing across the valley, it was clear the villagers were in serious danger. Vance's voice came through the radio, calm and steady despite the chaos ahead. "Move in, protect the village, minimize harm wherever possible. That is the priority." Daniel followed Marcus through the trees, staying low, his heart hammering in his chest. When they finally reached the edge of the village, he saw families running for cover, children crying, elderly villagers struggling to move fast enough. The armed group had taken position near the village center, and it was clear they had come prepared to take whatever they wanted by force. What happened next unfolded faster than Daniel could fully process. The unit moved with a coordination that seemed almost impossible, positioning themselves to protect the fleeing villagers while pushing back against the armed group. Ryan Cole's steady presence beside him gave Daniel the confidence to do his part, following instructions, guiding families toward safety, staying alert to every movement around him. Within 20 minutes, the armed group had retreated, driven back by a unit that fought with a precision and control Daniel had never witnessed before. There was no unnecessary aggression, no wasted effort. Every action seemed calculated toward one single goal, keeping the people of Ashvale safe. When it was over, Daniel stood in the center of the village, breathing hard, watching as families slowly emerged from their hiding places. An elderly woman approached Vance, tears in her eyes, and took his hands in hers, speaking words of gratitude, in a language Daniel did not understand, but did not need translated. That night, back at camp, Daniel sat with Marcus and Ryan around a small fire, still processing everything he had witnessed. "They call us monsters," Daniel said quietly, but that woman looked at Vance like he was the furthest thing from one. Marcus nodded slowly. "People fear what they don't understand. We do things most soldiers won't do, go places most units won't go. That fear turns into stories, and the stories turn into a name. But ask the people we protect what they think, and you'll get a very different answer." Ryan glanced at Daniel, her expression unreadable in the firelight. "Just remember," she said, "the name might not tell the truth about us, but it should still remind you what we're capable of when it's needed." Daniel looked around the camp, at the quiet efficiency of the people settling in for the night, at the discipline and care hidden beneath a fearsome reputation. He thought about the whispers back at the base, about the legend that had followed this unit for years, and he began to understand, for the first time, that the truth was far more complicated than any rumor could capture. He did not know it yet, but the events of that first day would shape everything that followed. The bond he would form with these men and women, the trust he would place in them, and the loyalty that would grow between them, would all be tested in ways he could not yet imagine. For now, he simply sat by the fire, grateful to be alive, and slowly beginning to feel, for the first time in a long while, like he belonged somewhere. The days that followed brought more missions, more nights like the one in Ashvale, and slowly, Daniel began to see the unit not as monsters, but as something far more complicated than the name suggested. He did not yet know that the true test of his loyalty, and the true danger to his life, would not come from the enemies they fought in the field. It would come from the very people who were supposed to be on his side. Weeks passed at the camp in Kestrel Valley, and with each passing day, Daniel Cross found himself changing in ways he had not expected. The nervous young man who had climbed into an unmarked truck in the middle of the night was slowly giving way to someone steadier, someone who understood the rhythm of this strange new life. Mornings began before sunrise, with drills that tested not just his body but his patience, and evenings often ended with quiet conversations around a fire, where the walls between strangers slowly came down. He learned that the unit operated differently than any group he had trained with before. There was no shouting, no harsh punishment for mistakes. Instead, there was correction, patience, and a strange kind of respect that seemed to grow the more time he spent among them. Vance rarely raised his voice, yet every person in the camp listened to him as if his words carried more weight than any order ever could. One afternoon, while cleaning equipment outside the main building, Daniel found himself sitting beside Grace Bennett, the woman who had shown him to his room on his first night. She worked with careful precision, her hands moving over a rifle, with the same gentleness someone might use to comfort a frightened animal. "You've been quiet," she said, without looking up. "Just thinking," Daniel admitted, "about Ashvale, about all of this." Grace set the rifle down and studied him for a moment. "It gets easier to carry, but it never gets lighter," she said. "The first mission changes you. So does everyone after it. The trick is learning what to hold on to." "What do you hold on to?" She thought about the question longer than he expected. "The faces of the people we help. Not the ones we fight. The ones we save. That's what keeps this work from turning into something ugly." Daniel nodded slowly, turning her words over in his mind. He was beginning to understand something important about this unit, something that the stories back at the base had never captured. These were not reckless people chasing danger for its own sake. They were careful, deliberate, bound together by a code that valued life over everything else, even when the world around them made that difficult. Over the following weeks, Daniel was tested in ways both large and small. There were long nights of training exercises designed to push him past his limits, simulations that forced him to make split-second decisions under pressure. There were also quieter tests, moments when Vance or one of the senior members would ask his opinion on a plan, watching closely to see how he thought, how he weighed risk against reward, how he treated the people around him. He began to understand that trust in this unit was not given freely. It was earned, one small moment at a time, through consistency and care, rather than grand gestures. He watched Marcus Hale patch up a wounded local farmer with the same intensity he brought to planning an operation, and he watched Ryan Cole spend an entire evening teaching a group of village children how to read a simple map, turning what could have been a dull lesson into something the children laughed and cheered over. Slowly, piece by piece, the unit became something more than colleagues to Daniel. They became something closer to family. It was during this time that he learned more about the unit's history, about how it had come to exist in the first place. One evening, as a storm rolled through the valley and confined everyone to the main building, Vance sat with a small group near the fire and spoke more openly than Daniel had ever heard him speak before. "This unit wasn't created by any government plan," Vance said, his eyes fixed on the flames. "It was created because there were places the official forces would not go, situations they would not touch, because the risk was too high, or the politics too complicated. We stepped in where others stepped back. Over time, word spread, and people who needed help learned to send for us." "And the people in charge just let you operate like this?" Daniel asked. Vance's expression darkened slightly. "For now, as long as we get results, and as long as we stay useful to the larger goals of the region, they leave us alone. But that kind of freedom rarely lasts forever. Someone always wants control eventually." Daniel did not think much of the comment at the time, though later he would remember it as one of the first warnings of what was to come. The unit's reputation, meanwhile, continued to grow throughout the region. Villages that had once feared the unnamed soldiers who fought without official banners began instead to send word ahead, hoping for their protection rather than fearing their arrival. Daniel began to see, firsthand, the strange irony of the name monsters. The very people who should have feared them most had come to see them as their greatest hope. One mission in particular stayed with Daniel long after it ended. The unit received word that a group of armed raiders had taken control of a small mountain settlement, holding the residents captive while they stripped the town of supplies. The situation was delicate, requiring patience rather than force, since any sudden movement risked harm to the very people they were trying to protect. Vance devised a plan that relied almost entirely on careful positioning and patience, waiting for the right moment rather than rushing into action. Daniel spent nearly 6 hours lying motionless in the underbrush beside Ryan Cole, watching the settlement through binoculars, memorizing the movement patterns of the raiders below. "This is the part people never see," Ryan whispered to him at one point. "Everyone imagines soldiers charging in, guns blazing. Most of the real work happens in moments like this: watching, waiting, understanding the situation before acting." When the moment finally came, the unit moved with a coordination that left Daniel in awe. Every step had been planned, every possibility accounted for. The raiders were pushed out of the settlement without a single resident being harmed, and by the time the operation ended, the town's residents were already beginning to rebuild what had been taken from them. That night, as they made their way back to camp, Daniel found himself walking beside Vance for the first time since his arrival. "You did well today," Vance said. "Patience is harder to teach than courage. Most people think bravery means rushing forward. Real bravery is knowing when to wait." "Thank you, sir." Vance glanced at him, something almost like warmth in his expression. "You're becoming one of us, Cross. That's not something I say lightly." The words meant more to Daniel than he expected, and he carried them with him for days afterward, a quiet source of pride that helped steady him through the exhaustion of the missions that followed. As the months passed, Daniel's bond with the unit deepened further. He learned the small details that made each person more than just a fellow soldier. Marcus Hale, despite his intimidating presence, had a quiet love of old music, humming tunes under his breath during long watches. Grace Bennett kept a small notebook filled with sketches of the villages they passed through, each page a tribute to the places they had helped protect. Ryan Cole, for all her calm precision in the field, laughed more easily than anyone else once the mission was over, her humor dry and unexpected. Daniel began to feel, for the first time in years, like he had found a place where he truly belonged. The loneliness that had followed him since childhood, the sense of drifting without purpose that had led him to enlist in the first place, began to fade, replaced by something steadier. He trusted these people with his life, and more importantly, he had come to believe they would do the same for him without hesitation. It was this trust, this deep and hard-earned bond, that made what came next so difficult to accept. The first sign of change arrived quietly, almost unnoticed at first. A convoy of unfamiliar vehicles arrived at the edge of Kestrel Valley one morning, carrying officials from the regional government, along with a group of soldiers dressed in crisp, unfamiliar uniforms. Word spread quickly through the camp that a new command structure was being introduced, one meant to bring the unit under closer official oversight. Vance called a meeting that evening, his expression more guarded than Daniel had ever seen it. "There's a new arrangement being put in place," Vance said, standing before the gathered unit. "A colonel, by the name of Whitfield, has been assigned to oversee operations in this region going forward. We'll be working alongside his forces from now on." A murmur passed through the room, uneasy and uncertain. "What does that mean for us?" Marcus asked. "It means we follow a new chain of command," Vance said carefully. "For now, that's all I know. We'll learn more in the coming days." Daniel glanced around the room, watching the reactions of the people he had come to trust so deeply. There was no panic, no outward fear, but something in the air had shifted, a quiet tension that had not existed before. He did not yet understand what this change would mean, but he could sense, in the careful way Vance chose his words, that even the commander was uncertain about what was coming. 2 days later, Colonel Whitfield arrived at the camp in person, accompanied by a small entourage of officers. He was a tall man, with the kind of polished presence that suggested years spent in official settings, rather than on the ground in places like Kestrel Valley. His uniform was immaculate, his manner confident and composed, and when he addressed the unit for the first time, his words were smooth and carefully chosen. "I want to commend all of you on the work you've done here," Whitfield said, standing before the gathered soldiers with an easy smile. "The results speak for themselves. Going forward, my goal is simply to bring a bit more structure to these operations, to ensure everything aligns with the broader strategy for this region. I have no doubt we'll work well together." Daniel watched the faces around him, searching for reassurance, but found only cautious neutrality. Vance's expression, in particular, remained unreadable, though Daniel noticed his jaw was set in a way that suggested he was choosing his patience carefully. That evening, as the unit settled in for the night, Daniel found himself once again beside Marcus near the fire. "What do you make of him?" Daniel asked quietly. Marcus stared into the flames for a long moment before answering. "Men like that talk about structure and strategy, but what they really mean is control. I've seen it before, in other places, other conflicts. It rarely ends well. You think he'll cause problems?" Marcus's expression darkened. "I think people who've never had to make the hard calls in the field are usually the ones most eager to make them from a distance. We'll see soon enough what kind of man he really is." Daniel did not sleep well that night, his mind turning over the events of the day, the polished smile of Colonel Whitfield, and the quiet unease that had settled over the camp since his arrival. He thought back to Vance's words from weeks earlier, about how the unit's freedom would not last forever, about how someone would eventually want control. He did not yet know how right that warning would prove to be, or how much it would cost the people he had come to see as family. In the weeks following Colonel Whitfield's arrival, the atmosphere at the camp in Kestrel Valley began to shift in small but noticeable ways. Missions that had once been planned entirely by Vance and the senior members of the unit now required approval from Whitfield's office, a process that added delay and confusion to operations that had always depended on speed and flexibility. Daniel noticed the change most clearly in Vance himself, whose usual calm confidence had given way to a quiet, simmering frustration that he tried, not always successfully, to hide from the rest of the unit. The first real friction came during a mission briefing, less than 2 weeks after Whitfield's arrival. Vance stood before a map of the region, outlining a plan to intercept a group of armed smugglers believed to be moving weapons through a mountain pass near the eastern border. It was the kind of mission the unit had handled dozens of times before, requiring careful positioning and patience rather than force. Halfway through the briefing, the door to the tent opened, and Whitfield entered, flanked by 2 of his officers. "I've reviewed this plan," he said, without preamble. "I want a different approach. Move in faster, take the pass directly, and secure the weapons before they can be moved further into the valley." Vance's jaw tightened. "That approach exposes our people to unnecessary risk. The current plan minimizes danger to both our unit and any civilians who might be in the area." "The current plan takes too long," Whitfield replied smoothly. "We need results the regional command can point to. A quick, decisive action sends the right message." Daniel watched the exchange with growing unease, sensing the careful restraint in Vance's voice, as he tried to explain, once again, the reasoning behind the unit's methods. But Whitfield was not interested in reasoning. He wanted outcomes that looked impressive on paper, regardless of the risks involved in achieving them. In the end, Vance was overruled, and the mission proceeded according to Whitfield's revised plan. Daniel found himself moving through the mountain pass that night with a sense of unease he had never felt before, the careful discipline of previous missions replaced by a rushed urgency that left little room for the patience the unit usually relied upon. The mission succeeded, in the sense that the weapons were secured and the smugglers were driven off. But it came at a cost. 2 members of the unit suffered serious injuries during the operation, wounds that Grace worked through the night to treat, her usually steady hands trembling with exhaustion and frustration by the time she finished. "This didn't need to happen," she said quietly to Daniel afterward, cleaning her equipment with more force than necessary. "We've done missions like this 100 times without anyone getting hurt. The only difference this time was the rush." Daniel did not have an answer for her, and he found himself, for the first time since joining the unit, questioning the direction things were heading. Over the following weeks, the pattern repeated itself again and again. Whitfield consistently pushed for faster, more aggressive approaches, dismissing the careful methods that had defined the unit's success since its founding. Vance pushed back whenever he could, but his authority, once absolute within the camp, was steadily eroding under the weight of the new command structure. Daniel began to notice other changes as well, smaller details that on their own might have seemed insignificant, but together painted a troubling picture. Supply requests that Vance submitted were often delayed or denied, while requests from Whitfield's own officers were approved without question. Intelligence reports that reached the unit seemed increasingly filtered, missing details that Daniel suspected had once been shared freely. One evening, while helping Marcus repair a damaged vehicle, Daniel voiced the concerns that had been building inside him for weeks. "Something isn't right," he said. "Whitfield isn't just changing how we operate. It feels like he's trying to control what we even know." Marcus paused his work, wiping grease from his hands as he considered the observation. "I've been watching the same thing," he admitted. "Men like Whitfield don't build trust. They build leverage. Every decision he makes seems designed to put more power in his hands and less in ours. But why? What does he gain from that?" Marcus's expression turned grim. "I don't know yet." But when someone starts consolidating control this carefully, it's rarely for a reason that benefits the people underneath him. The tension came to a head, nearly a month after Whitfield's arrival, when the unit received word of a situation unfolding in a village called Marrow Hollow, nestled in a valley not far from Kestrel. Reports indicated that an armed faction had moved into the area, and unlike previous situations, the details of this particular group were unusually vague, the intelligence report thin compared to what the unit typically received before an operation. Vance called for a full briefing, his expression more serious than Daniel had seen since Whitfield's arrival. "Something about this mission doesn't add up," he said, addressing the gathered unit. "The intelligence is incomplete, and the timeline being pushed by Whitfield's office doesn't leave room for proper reconnaissance." "What are you saying?" Ryan asked. "I'm saying we need more information before we move forward," Vance replied. "I've requested additional reconnaissance time, but Whitfield has denied the request. He wants us moving into Marrow Hollow within 24 hours. The room fell silent, the weight of the decision settling over everyone present. Daniel could see the conflict in Vance's expression, the tension between his duty to follow orders and his responsibility to protect the people under his command. "We'll proceed with caution," Vance finally said, "but I want everyone alert. Something about this feels wrong." The following day, the unit moved toward Marrow Hollow, the usual confidence and coordination that had defined their previous missions, replaced by a cautious uncertainty that Daniel could feel radiating through the group. As they approached the outskirts of the village, the silence was almost unnerving. None of the usual signs of conflict that typically accompanied reports of an armed faction moving into an area. "Something's wrong," Ryan murmured, her rifle raised as she scanned the tree line. "This is too quiet." Vance's voice came through the radio, low and urgent. "Hold positions. I want eyes on the village before we move any closer." Through his binoculars, Daniel could see the village below, quiet and seemingly undisturbed. Nothing like the chaotic scenes he had witnessed during the mission at Ashvale months earlier. There were no signs of an armed faction, no smoke, no fleeing villagers, just an eerie stillness that felt entirely wrong, given the intelligence they had received. "Command, this is Vance," he said into the radio, addressing Whitfield's office directly. "The situation on the ground doesn't match the intelligence report, requesting permission to hold position and reassess." There was a long pause before Whitfield's voice crackled back through the radio. "Negative, Vance. Proceed with the operation as planned. We need this resolved today." Vance's frustration was audible even through the static of the radio. "With respect, sir, moving forward without accurate intelligence puts my people at unnecessary risk." "Your concerns are noted," Whitfield replied, his tone cold and final. "Proceed with the mission." Daniel watched as Vance lowered the radio, his expression a mixture of anger and helplessness that Daniel had never seen on his commander's face before. For a long moment, Vance said nothing, staring down at the quiet village below, clearly weighing every option available to him. "We move in slowly," Vance finally said, his voice tight with restrained frustration. "Everyone stays alert. If anything feels wrong, we pull back immediately. Orders or no orders." The unit descended into Marrow Hollow with a caution that bordered on suspicion. Every step measured, every corner approached with careful attention. As they moved deeper into the village, Daniel began to notice small details that deepened his unease. Homes that appeared recently abandoned, meals left half-eaten on tables, personal belongings scattered as though people had left in a hurry, but without the signs of struggle or destruction that typically accompanied an armed takeover. "This doesn't look like an attack," Grace said quietly, examining one of the abandoned homes. "It looks like the villagers left on their own, and recently." Vance's expression grew increasingly troubled as they continued their search, finding no trace of the armed faction the intelligence report had described. The village was simply empty, its residents gone without explanation, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier with every passing minute. It was Ryan who found the first real clue, discovering a set of vehicle tracks leading away from the village toward the eastern hills, tracks that did not match any equipment the unit itself used. "These are recent," she said, kneeling to examine the marks in the dirt, "within the last day, maybe less." Vance studied the tracks for a long moment, before standing, his expression hardening into something Daniel had not seen before. "Something happened here, and it wasn't what we were told to expect. I want answers before we do anything else." As the unit prepared to investigate further, Daniel's radio crackled with an unexpected transmission, not from Whitfield's command, but from a frequency the unit rarely used, reserved for emergency situations only. Grace, monitoring the communications equipment, went pale as she listened to the incoming message. "Vance," she said, her voice unsteady, "you need to hear this." She played the recording for the assembled group, a message that had clearly been intercepted from a separate communication channel, one that did not belong to their unit, or, as far as Daniel could tell, to any group they had previously encountered. The voice on the recording was calm, businesslike, discussing logistics and timelines in a way that made Daniel's stomach twist with growing dread. "Villagers relocated as planned. Confirm the unit is being directed toward the eastern hills for the follow-up operation." Vance's face had gone completely still, the kind of stillness that Daniel had learned, over the months, to associate with barely controlled fury. "That's not our frequency," he said slowly. "And that's not our operation." "What does it mean?" Daniel asked, though some part of him already suspected the answer. "It means someone relocated the villagers deliberately," Vance said, his voice low and dangerous. "And it means whoever sent us here wanted us moving toward those eastern hills for a reason that has nothing to do with protecting anyone." The pieces began falling into place with a horrifying clarity that left Daniel struggling to process what he was hearing. The vague intelligence report, the pressure to move quickly, without proper reconnaissance, the empty village, evacuated rather than attacked. And now, evidence of a separate operation unfolding in the very direction they had been ordered to proceed. "We're being used," Marcus said quietly, voicing the realization that had settled over the entire group. This was never about protecting Marrow Hollow. "We were sent here to be somewhere specific, at a specific time." Vance stood in silence for a long moment, staring toward the eastern hills where the vehicle tracks disappeared into the distance. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight Daniel had never heard from him before. "I want full alert status, effective immediately," Vance said. "We are not proceeding further until I understand exactly what is happening here, and exactly what role Colonel Whitfield's office intends for us to play." As the unit regrouped, establishing a defensive position at the edge of the abandoned village, Daniel found himself standing beside Vance, watching the distant hills with a growing sense that everything he had believed about their situation was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. "Sir," Daniel said quietly, "what do you think is out there?" Vance did not answer immediately, his eyes fixed on the horizon, his expression unreadable in the fading afternoon light. When he finally spoke, his words carried a grim certainty that settled deep into Daniel's chest. "I think," Vance said slowly, "that we are about to learn exactly what kind of man Colonel Whitfield really is, and I do not think we are going to like the answer." The sun continued its slow descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the empty village of Marrow Hollow. And somewhere in the eastern hills, something was waiting. Something that would change everything Daniel Cross believed about the war he had been fighting, and the people he had trusted to fight it alongside him. Night fell over Marrow Hollow, and with it came a tension that settled deep into every member of the unit. Vance ordered a small reconnaissance team to move toward the eastern hills, choosing Daniel, Marcus, and Ryan to accompany him personally, while Grace remained behind with the rest of the unit to secure the village and maintain communications. They moved through the darkness with practiced silence, following the vehicle tracks that Ryan had discovered earlier, each step careful and deliberate. Daniel's heart pounded steadily in his chest, not from exhaustion, but from a growing sense of dread that had settled over him since hearing the intercepted transmission. Whatever waited in those hills, he understood now that it was connected to Whitfield in ways that promised nothing good. After nearly an hour of careful movement, Ryan raised a closed fist, signaling the group to stop. Ahead, through a break in the trees, a faint glow was visible, artificial light spilling from what appeared to be a temporary camp nestled in a shallow valley between two hills. "There," Ryan whispered, pointing toward the light. "Vehicles, at least 6, and structures, temporary ones." They moved closer, staying low, until they reached a position where they could observe the camp without being seen. What Daniel saw below made his blood run cold. The camp was filled with soldiers wearing the same uniforms as Whitfield's officers, moving efficiently between a cluster of vehicles and several large tents. But more disturbing than the soldiers themselves were the villagers, dozens of them, gathered in a fenced area near the center of the camp, guarded closely by armed personnel. "Those are the people from Marrow Hollow," Marcus said quietly, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "They didn't evacuate on their own. They were taken." Vance's expression had hardened into something Daniel had never seen before, a controlled fury that radiated from every line of his posture. "I want to know why," he said. "I want to know exactly what Whitfield is planning here." They continued observing the camp for nearly 20 minutes, gathering as much information as possible without risking exposure. It was during this time that Daniel noticed a smaller group of officers gathered near one of the central tents, engaged in what appeared to be a tense conversation. Using a directional listening device that Ryan carried among her equipment, they managed to capture fragments of the discussion. "The unit will be positioned exactly where we need them by morning," one voice said, unmistakably Whitfield's. "Once they're in place, we proceed with the operation as discussed. Their presence provides exactly the cover story we need." "And the villagers?" another voice asked. "Relocated once the operation concludes." Nobody asks questions about missing villagers in this region. It happens far too often for anyone to investigate closely. Daniel felt a cold weight settle in his stomach as the implications became clear. Whitfield was not simply reorganizing the unit's operations. He was using them, deliberately and without their knowledge, as cover for something far larger and far more dangerous. Something that involved holding an entire village's population against their will. "What operation is he talking about?" Daniel whispered, though he already suspected the answer would be worse than anything he could imagine. Vance's jaw tightened as he continued listening, his expression growing darker with every fragment of conversation they managed to capture. Finally, after several more minutes, the pieces came together into a picture that left all 4 of them in stunned, horrified silence. Whitfield was planning to stage an attack on the region's supply routes, an attack that would be blamed on the very armed faction the intelligence report had originally described, a faction that, as far as Daniel could tell, did not actually exist in the way they had been told. The unit's presence in Marrow Hollow had been engineered to establish a cover story, positioning them as witnesses to an attack that Whitfield's own forces intended to carry out themselves, using the captured villagers as leverage to ensure the story held together under scrutiny. "This is bigger than us," Marcus said quietly, once they had retreated far enough from the camp to speak safely. "Whitfield isn't just some overzealous commander trying to make a name for himself. This is coordinated, planned. He has resources and support behind him that go well beyond regional command." Vance said nothing for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the distant glow of the camp behind them. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that Daniel had never heard before, heavy with a betrayal that cut far deeper than anger. We spent months building trust with the people of this region, Vance said slowly, protecting them, earning their confidence, showing them that not every uniform brings danger. And now Whitfield intends to use that trust, use us, to cover for an operation that will hurt the very people we swore to protect. What do we do? Daniel asked, his voice barely steady. Vance was quiet for a long moment before answering. We get back to the unit. We free those villagers, and we make sure Whitfield's operation never happens. The journey back to Marrow Hollow felt longer than the journey out, each step weighed down by the horror of what they had discovered. Daniel found his mind returning again and again to the elderly woman from Ashvale, the tears of gratitude in her eyes as she thanked Vance for saving her village. He thought about all the trust they had built, all the lives they had protected, and the sickening realization that a man in a polished uniform, hiding behind official authority, had planned to twist that trust into a weapon against the very people who had come to rely on it. When they returned to the main group, Vance gathered everyone together, laying out exactly what they had discovered. The reaction among the unit was immediate and unified, a quiet, controlled fury that reminded Daniel of the discipline he had witnessed during his very first mission months earlier. "We're not following Whitfield's orders any further," Vance said, addressing the assembled unit. "Our priority now is freeing those villagers and stopping whatever operation he's planning before innocent people pay the price for his ambitions." "And after that?" Grace asked. "What happens to us once we've gone against direct orders from regional command?" Vance's expression was grim, but resolute. "I don't know, but I would rather face whatever consequences come from doing the right thing than live with the consequences of standing by while Whitfield uses us to hurt the people we've sworn to protect." The plan they devised was careful and deliberate, drawing on months of experience working together, every member of the unit contributing their particular skills to the effort. Ryan would provide overwatch from a distance, ready to respond to any threat that emerged during the operation. Marcus and a small team would approach the camp from the northern side, creating a distraction that would draw attention away from the fenced area holding the villagers. Grace would coordinate medical support, prepared for any injuries that might occur during the rescue. And Daniel, alongside Vance, would lead the effort to free the captured villagers directly. As the unit moved into position under the cover of darkness, Daniel felt a strange calm settle over him, different from the nervous energy of his first mission months earlier. This was not simply another operation. This was a moment of reckoning, a chance to prove that the loyalty and trust he had found within this unit meant something more than the polished lies of men like Whitfield. The operation began just before dawn, Marcus's team creating a controlled disturbance near the northern edge of the camp that drew the attention of nearly a third of Whitfield's forces. In the resulting confusion, Daniel and Vance moved swiftly toward the fenced area holding the villagers, working quickly and quietly to disable the perimeter security without raising alarm. Daniel would remember, for the rest of his life, the look on the villagers' faces when they realized who had come for them, not more captors, but the very people who had protected Ashvale months earlier, and who had built a reputation throughout the region as protectors rather than threats. An elderly man near the front of the group recognized Vance immediately, his eyes widening with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "You came," the man whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. "We heard the monsters were the ones bringing us here. We thought we would never do that," Vance said quietly, his voice steady despite the danger surrounding them. "Whoever told you that lied to you. Now we need to move quickly, and quietly, to get everyone to safety." The rescue unfolded with a precision that left Daniel in awe, even amid the danger of the situation. The unit moved the villagers away from the camp through a route Ryan had scouted earlier, avoiding the patrols that Whitfield's forces had established around the perimeter. By the time the sun began rising over the eastern hills, the villagers were safely on their way back toward Marrow Hollow, escorted by members of the unit who had spent months earning the very trust that had made this rescue possible. But as the operation concluded, and the unit began regrouping at a safe distance from the camp, Vance's radio crackled with an incoming transmission, one that made his expression darken with a fury Daniel had never witnessed before. "Vance," Whitfield's voice came through, cold and sharp with barely restrained anger. "I am aware of what you've done. This is a direct violation of command authority, and I assure you, there will be consequences. You have compromised an operation of significant importance to regional security. Vance's grip on the radio tightened, his knuckles white with restrained fury. The operation you're referring to involved holding an entire village hostage to stage a false attack, Colonel. I would call that a violation far more serious than anything I've done. There was a long pause before Whitfield responded, his voice carrying a chilling calm that unsettled Daniel more than any anger could have. You misunderstand the situation, Vance. What you've interfered with goes well beyond your understanding or your authority. I strongly suggest you and your unit stand down immediately, before this situation escalates beyond anyone's control. We're not standing down, Vance replied, his voice steady despite the threat implicit in Whitfield's words. Not until the people of this region are safe from whatever you're planning. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving the unit standing in tense silence as the full weight of their situation settled over them. They had exposed Whitfield's operation, rescued the villagers he had planned to use as leverage, and in doing so, had made themselves targets of a man with resources and authority far beyond anything they had previously understood. This isn't over, Marcus said quietly, watching the horizon where Whitfield's camp remained hidden among the eastern hills. A man like that doesn't simply accept defeat. He'll come back, and next time, he won't be nearly as careful about the methods he uses. Vance nodded slowly, his expression grim but resolute. Then we prepare. Whatever Whitfield intends to do next, we will be ready for it. We've spent months earning the trust of the people in this region, and I do not intend to let him destroy that now, regardless of the cost. As the unit made their way back toward Marrow Hollow, escorting the rescued villagers to safety, Daniel found himself reflecting on everything that had happened since Whitfield's arrival weeks earlier. The polished smile, the careful words about structure and strategy, all of it had been nothing more than a mask hiding intentions far darker than anything Daniel had encountered during his time with the unit. He thought about the whispers that had followed this unit for years, the fearful stories that had labeled them monsters long before he had ever joined their ranks. He understood now, with a clarity that left him both angry and resolved, that the true monsters had never worn the uniforms of the unit he had come to call family. They had been hiding, all along, behind polished boots and official authority, waiting for the right moment to reveal exactly what they were capable of. And as dawn broke fully over Kestrel Valley, casting long shadows across the hills where Whitfield's camp remained hidden, Daniel understood that the greatest battle of this conflict was only just beginning. The days following the rescue at Marrow Hollow were unlike any the unit had experienced before. There was no relief in the aftermath, no sense of a mission completed and closed. Instead, a heavy uncertainty settled over the camp, the knowledge that they had exposed something far larger than themselves, and that the consequences of that exposure were still unfolding. Vance called a meeting on the second morning after the rescue, gathering the entire unit inside the main building as rain fell steadily outside. His expression, usually so composed, carried the visible weight of the decisions ahead of him. We need to think carefully about our next steps, he began. Whitfield has resources and authority that go beyond what any of us initially understood. If we simply wait for him to act, we hand him the advantage. We need evidence, something concrete enough to bring this to people who can actually stop him.
The recording, Grace said. The one we intercepted. That's evidence.
It's a start, Vance agreed. But a single recording can be dismissed, altered, questioned. We need more. Documentation, witnesses. Something that cannot simply be explained away by a man with Whitfield's connections. Daniel listened carefully, understanding the weight of what Vance was proposing. This was no longer simply about defending a village or completing a mission. This was about uncovering a conspiracy that reached beyond their small unit, one that threatened not just their own safety, but the safety of every community throughout the region that had come to trust them. Over the following days, the unit worked with a quiet, determined focus, gathering every piece of evidence they could find. Ryan reviewed the intercepted communications repeatedly, cross-referencing timestamps and locations to build a clearer picture of Whitfield's operation. Marcus reached out to contacts he had cultivated over years of service in the region, careful, trusted sources who might know more about the network Whitfield was operating within. Grace worked with the rescued villagers, gently gathering their accounts of what had happened, testimonies that would prove crucial in establishing the truth of what Whitfield had attempted. Daniel found himself drawn into a role he had not expected, working alongside Vance to piece together a timeline of events, connecting the dots between Whitfield's arrival, the sudden changes to the unit's operations, and the elaborate plan that had nearly succeeded in framing an innocent village for an attack it had nothing to do with. It was during this period that Daniel began to understand the true depth of what they were facing. Through careful investigation, they discovered that Whitfield was not acting alone, nor was he operating purely on his own initiative. He was connected to a broader network within the regional command structure, officials who had grown frustrated with the unit's independence and had seen an opportunity to discredit them, replacing their unconventional but effective methods with operations that served different, less transparent interests. "They wanted us gone," Vance said one evening, studying a collection of documents Marcus's contacts had managed to provide. "Not because we failed at our mission, but because we succeeded too well, and in doing so, we became inconvenient to people who preferred quieter, more controllable arrangements in this region." The revelation settled uneasily over the unit. They had spent months believing their greatest challenge came from the armed groups and conflicts scattered throughout Kestrel Valley. Instead, the greatest threat had come from within the very structure meant to support and direct their efforts, from officials who valued control and appearance over the actual safety of the people they claimed to serve. As the evidence continued to accumulate, Vance made the difficult decision to reach out beyond regional command entirely, contacting a senior official within the national government who had, in years past, expressed genuine support for the unit's unconventional methods. It was a significant risk, one that could easily backfire if the official proved to be part of the same network protecting Whitfield's operation. The response, when it finally came, offered a cautious but genuine opening. The official, a woman named Eleanor Vance's contact had described only as reliable, agreed to review the evidence personally, requesting a secure meeting to discuss the situation in greater detail. The meeting took place nearly 2 weeks after the events at Marrow Hollow, in a location far from Kestrel Valley, chosen carefully to avoid any possibility of interference from Whitfield's network. Vance, accompanied by Daniel and Marcus, traveled to the meeting with the collected evidence, uncertain what outcome awaited them. The official who greeted them was measured and careful in her questions, examining every piece of evidence with a scrutiny that left little room for exaggeration or embellishment. Daniel found himself explaining, in careful detail, everything he had witnessed at the camp in the Eastern Hills, the captured villagers, the intercepted conversation, revealing Whitfield's true intentions. "This is serious," the official said finally, after nearly 2 hours of review. "If everything you're presenting holds up under formal investigation, this goes well beyond a single colonel acting out of ambition. This points toward a coordinated effort to manipulate operations throughout this entire region, for purposes that have nothing to do with the safety of the people living here." "What happens now?" Vance asked. "Now, we investigate properly," she replied. "I won't pretend this will be simple or quick. Whitfield has protection within the system, connections that will not disappear easily, but the evidence you've gathered is substantial enough to begin a formal inquiry, one that I intend to pursue personally." The weeks that followed tested the patience of everyone in the unit. They returned to Kestrel Valley, uncertain of what consequences might follow their actions, aware that Whitfield remained a dangerous and unpredictable presence in the region, even as the formal inquiry slowly gathered momentum. The unit continued its work protecting local villages, though always with a heightened awareness, watching carefully for any sign that Whitfield might attempt retaliation before the investigation could conclude. That retaliation came sooner than anyone expected. Nearly a month after the meeting with the government official, the unit received word that Whitfield's forces were mobilizing near the border of Kestrel Valley, preparing what appeared to be a significant operation. Intelligence gathered by Marcus's contacts suggested Whitfield intended to strike before the investigation could reach its conclusion, hoping to create a crisis significant enough to overshadow the growing scrutiny of his previous actions. Vance gathered the unit once more, his expression carrying the weight of the decision ahead of him. "We cannot simply wait for the investigation to run its course," he said. "If Whitfield moves forward, with whatever he's planning, more people will suffer for it. We need to act, but carefully, in a way that protects the evidence we've already gathered, while preventing whatever harm he intends to cause." The plan that followed relied on everything the unit had learned over the preceding months, careful coordination, patience, and a deep understanding of the region they had come to protect. Working alongside trusted local contacts, they gathered intelligence on Whitfield's movements, tracking his forces as they prepared for an operation aimed at a cluster of villages near the border, communities that had, over the preceding months, become some of the unit's strongest allies. When the moment finally came, the unit moved with the same precision and discipline that had defined their very first mission together in Ashvale, months earlier. Daniel found himself once again beside Ryan, providing overwatch, as Marcus and a small team moved to intercept Whitfield's forces before they could reach the border villages. Grace coordinated with local leaders, ensuring civilians were moved to safety well before any confrontation could occur. The operation unfolded over the course of a tense night, the unit working to disrupt Whitfield's plans without escalating the situation into open conflict. Daniel watched, from his position overlooking the border road, as Vance personally confronted Whitfield's convoy, presenting him with undeniable evidence that the formal investigation had already begun, that his network of protection within regional command was crumbling under the weight of scrutiny he could no longer avoid. What happened next surprised everyone. Faced with the reality that his operation had been exposed, and that continuing forward would only strengthen the case against him, Whitfield ordered his forces to withdraw, his carefully constructed authority collapsing under the pressure of consequences he had never expected to face. In the weeks that followed, the formal investigation reached its conclusion, revealing the full scope of Whitfield's network and the officials who had supported his efforts to undermine the unit's independence. Whitfield himself was removed from his position, along with several other officials implicated in the conspiracy, their carefully built reputations dismantled by the very evidence the unit had risked everything to gather. The village of Marrow Hollow, along with the other communities throughout Kestrel Valley, slowly returned to a sense of normalcy, their trust in the unit not only restored, but deepened by the knowledge of what had been risked on their behalf. Daniel watched, in the months that followed, as the bonds between the unit and the people they protected grew stronger than ever before, built now on a foundation that had been tested by betrayal and had emerged, ultimately, unbroken. One evening, nearly 6 months after the events in Marrow Hollow, Daniel sat once again beside the fire at the camp in Kestrel Valley, surrounded by the people who had become, over the course of a single tumultuous year, the closest thing to family he had ever known. Marcus hummed quietly to himself as he cleaned his equipment. Grace sketched in her notebook, capturing the quiet peace of the evening. Ryan sat nearby, sharpening a blade with the same careful precision she brought to everything she did. Vance approached and sat down beside him, watching the flames in comfortable silence for a long moment, before speaking. "You've changed a great deal since that first night," Vance said. "The young man who climbed into that truck seems like someone from a very different life." Daniel smiled slightly, considering the truth in those words. "I suppose I have. I came here believing the greatest danger would come from the people we fought in the field. I never imagined the real threat would come from someone claiming to be on our side." Vance nodded slowly. "That's a lesson most people never learn, not until it's too late. The uniform someone wears, the authority they carry, none of that guarantees good intentions. What matters is what someone does when no one is watching, how they treat the people who have no power to fight back." Daniel thought about the elderly woman from Ashvale, about the villagers of Marrow Hollow, about everyone the unit had protected throughout the year, often at tremendous personal risk. He thought about the name that had followed this unit for years, a name born from fear and misunderstanding, a name that had never captured the truth of who they really were. "They still call us monsters," Daniel said quietly. Vance's expression carried a quiet, weathered wisdom as he looked out over the camp, at the people who had built something extraordinary together in this remote valley. "Let them," he said. "The people who matter, the ones we've protected, know the truth. And sometimes, being called a monster by people who fear the truth is far better than being praised by people who hide it." Daniel nodded, understanding at last the full weight of everything he had learned since that first night, since climbing into an unmarked truck without knowing what awaited him. He had come searching for purpose, and he had found something far greater, a family bound together not by blood, but by a shared commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves, even when the greatest danger came from those who claimed to stand on the same side. As the fire crackled quietly before them, and the stars spread out endlessly above the valley, Daniel Cross understood that whatever challenges awaited them in the future, he would face them alongside people he trusted completely, people the world called monsters, but who had shown him, time and again, the truest meaning of courage and loyalty. The war in Kestrel Valley was far from over, and new dangers would surely arise in the months and years ahead. But for the first time since arriving in this remote corner of the world, Daniel felt something he had rarely known before. He felt, finally, at peace, secure in the knowledge that he had found not just a purpose, but a place where he truly belonged. And somewhere beyond the valley, word continued to spread among the people of the region, stories not of fear, but of gratitude, carried from village to village, keeping alive the truth about a unit the world had wrongly named, and about the humans who had once tried, and ultimately failed, to twist that name into a weapon against the very people it had always been meant to protect.